A gentle breeze rustled to settle, the letter's words echoing in her head. Go back to our old house. Look under the floorboards in my study. She was surprised. Her father's study. A place she hadn't stepped foot in since she was a child. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees as the sky darkened with heavy, rolling clouds. The cemetery stretched endlessly, rows of solemn gravestones standing like silent witnesses to grief. A soft drizzle had begun to fall, dotting the polished casket that rested over an open grave. Amoka stood motionless, her black veil clinging to her face, wet with both rain and tears. Her fingers gripped the handle of a black umbrella, though she had long since abandoned the idea of shielding herself from the weather. She barely noticed the soft murmurs of the priest as he recited the final rites. The words felt empty. Hollow. Like the space her father's death had left inside her. In the dust we shall return, the priest concluded, making the sign of the cross. The crowd mumbled a quiet amen. The scent of damp earth mixed with the fading aroma of funeral flowers, a fragrance Amoka knew she would never forget. People shuffled around her, some stepping forward to drop a handful of dirt onto the coffin. One by one, they murmured condolences, their voices distant and muffled in her ears. She barely acknowledged them. Her eyes remained locked on the wooden casket, her father's name engraved in silver, Chijioke Okafor, beloved father. Beloved. The word sat uncomfortably with her. How could a man she barely knew be called beloved? How could someone so distant, so full of secrets, be mourned as though he had been a devoted father? She swallowed hard, pushing down the bitterness rising in her throat. Now was not the time for resentment. Now was the time to say goodbye. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, a cold feeling crept over her skin, an uneasy sensation prickling at the back of her neck. She suddenly became aware of the crowd, too many unfamiliar faces. Some were distant relatives, others old friends of her father. Yet, scattered among them were people she didn't recognize, figures standing just at the edges of the gathering, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats and the collars of their coats. Watching. One man in particular caught her eye. He stood apart from the rest, his tall frame rigid, his hands buried deep in his trench coat pockets. His dark eyes met hers, unwavering, as if he had been waiting for her to notice him. Amoka's grip on the umbrella tightened. A cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery, making the leaves swirl around her feet. The man took a slow step forward. Then another. And then. He reached into his coat. For a fleeting moment, her pulse spiked. Was it a gun? A knife? An instinctual fear crawled up her spine. But as quickly as it came, the tension broke. His hand emerged, not with a weapon, but with a small, aged envelope. He walked past her without a word, subtly pressing the envelope into her hand. His fingers were ice-cold against her palm, lingering for just a second too long before he withdrew. Without another glance, he turned and disappeared into the thinning crowd, swallowed by the sea of black coats and umbrellas. Amoka's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the envelope. It was yellowed with age, edges slightly frayed, as if it had been handled many times before finally making its way to her. The paper was rough against her fingertips, the ink of her name slightly smudged from moisture. Amoka. Just her name. No sender. Her pulse thumped in her ears. She stole a glance around, searching for the man again. But he was gone. Vanished. As if he had never been there. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the envelope seal, the dampness making it easy to tear open. Inside was a single, folded piece of paper, its creases deep and well-worn. With hesitant hands, she unfolded it, eyes scanning the first few lines. My dearest Amoka, if you're reading this, it means I am gone. But I have left you something I never had the courage to tell you. The words blurred as the rain dripped onto the paper, smearing the ink. Amoka's breath hitched. Her grip on the letter tightened as an invisible weight settled on her chest. Her father had written this. When? Why had he never given it to her? And why had a complete stranger been the one to deliver it to her now? A rush of conflicting emotions surged through her. Grief, confusion, fear. But beneath it all, a quiet, growing sense of dread. What had her father been hiding? The priest's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Miss Okafor. She looked up, dazed. People were staring at her now, waiting. The priest motioned gently toward the grave. It was her turn to say goodbye. Amoka swallowed hard. Slowly, she stepped forward, her heels sinking slightly into the wet earth. She peered down into the grave, the wooden casket lying below like a sealed box of forgotten secrets. She clenched the letter in one hand and picked up a small handful of dirt with the other. The damp soil crumbled between her fingers before slipping through them, falling onto the casket with a soft thud. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Goodbye, Papa. She wanted to mean it. She wanted this to be closure. But as she stepped away, her fingers tightened around the letter. Because now, she knew, this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The drive back to her apartment was a blur of headlights and rain. Amoka's mind raced. She parked outside her apartment, but she didn't move. The storm outside had intensified, raindrops pelting against the windshield. With a deep breath, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter again, fingers tracing the faded ink. There was no mistaking it, this was her father's handwriting. What could be so important that he had hidden it in their old home? And why had he never spoken of it while alive? A part of her hesitated. Maybe she should ignore it. Maybe it was better not to disturb the past. But she knew herself better than that. She couldn't walk away from this. Not now. With a determined sigh, she started the car again. I'd go back home, she said to herself. She was going back home. Amoka pulled up to the familiar driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. The house stood before her, unchanged yet hauntingly different. The once vibrant garden was overgrown, weeds strangling the remnants of carefully planted flowers. The windows were dark, lifeless. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. A sudden gust of wind rattled the porch swing, sending a chill down her spine. Her hands trembled as she reached for the key hidden beneath the flower pot, a habit her father had never abandoned. The lock clicked open, and she stepped inside. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by her presence. The scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled her lungs. She hesitated at the doorway of her father's study. Taking a deep breath, she stepped in. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She knelt down, fingers tracing the edges of the wooden panels. Then, she pried one loose. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a small, locked box. Her father's secrets lay within. And she was about to uncover them. Amoka's hands trembled as she lifted the small, locked box from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. It was heavier than she expected, its exterior worn smooth with time. A layer of dust clung to the edges, as though it had been untouched for years. The lock was rusted, but it held firm. Her breath hitched as she ran her fingers over the surface, her pulse quickening. What had her father hidden here? What could be so important that he had chosen to bury it beneath the floor of his study rather than share it with her in life? She set the box on the old wooden desk, her fingers searching for something, anything, that might open it. She needed a key. But where? She scanned the room, her gaze flickering over the bookshelves, the towering stacks of paper, the dusty globe perched in the corner. Her father had been a meticulous man, always hiding things in plain sight. Her eyes landed on the antique clock on the wall. It had long since stopped ticking, frozen at 3:47. She hesitated, then stepped closer. With a sharp breath, she reached out and twisted the clock's face. It didn't budge. Then, remembering how her father used to fiddle with it when he was deep in thought, she tried again, this time pressing down firmly on the center. A small click echoed in the silent room. The clock face popped open, revealing a tiny compartment inside. Nestled within was a single, ornate key. Her fingers closed around it, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it. With careful hands, she returned to the desk and slid the key into the rusted lock. It resisted at first, stiff from years of disuse, but with a firm twist, it gave way. The lock clicked open, and the lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside, wrapped in delicate fabric, was a bundle of letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, their edges curled and fragile. Beneath them lay a worn leather journal, its cover cracked and faded. Amoka's hands shook as she picked up the first letter, recognizing the same handwriting from the note she had received at the funeral. My dearest Amoka, if you are reading this, then you have found what I was never brave enough to share with you. I have carried secrets, ones I feared would destroy the very image you had of me. But now, with my time gone, I can only hope that in understanding the truth, you will find clarity, even if it brings pain. She swallowed hard, her vision blurring. Secrets. What had her father been hiding? She set the letter down, her fingers tracing the spine of the journal. Slowly, she flipped it open. The pages were filled with hurried, desperate handwriting, a mixture of dates and scattered thoughts. As she scanned the entries, a particular line caught her eye. They are watching me. If anything happens to me, Amoka must know the truth. A chill ran through her. The words were dated just weeks before his death. Her fingers tightened around the journal. What had her father gotten himself into? Who were they? A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint creak from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she slowly turned her head. The dimly lit corridor stretched before her, empty yet suffocating in its silence. Had she imagined it? The old house had always groaned under its own weight. But something about this was different. She held her breath, listening. Another creak. Closer this time. Fear tightened in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. Someone else was here. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, she grabbed the box, stuffing the letters and journal inside. Slamming the lid shut, she shoved it back under the floorboards and replaced the wooden panel, pressing it down just as the sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase. Her heart pounded. She had to move. Now. With swift but silent steps, she slipped out of the study, pressing herself against the wall. Shadows flickered against the hallway as a figure moved downstairs, their presence casting long, eerie shapes against the dim light. Her breath was shallow, her muscles tensed. Who were they? And what did they want? She needed to escape. She inched toward the back door, careful to avoid the loose floorboards that would give her away. Just a few more steps and a sharp creak split the silence. She froze. The footsteps stopped. A long, dreadful pause followed. Then, a voice. Low, unfamiliar, and chillingly calm. I know you're here. The words sent ice through her veins. She didn't wait to find out who they were. With a sharp inhale, she bolted. The house erupted with movement. Heavy footsteps thundered after her as she sprinted toward the back door. Her hands fumbled with the latch, the metal slick with sweat. The door resisted for a fraction of a second, too long. A hand grabbed her wrist. She screamed, twisting violently, her elbow connecting with something solid. The grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free. Without looking back, She yanked the door open and threw herself into the night. The rain had started again, cold and unforgiving against her skin. She stumbled forward, feet slipping on the wet grass. Behind her, the figure had followed, their silhouette dark against the dim porch light. She didn't stop. Her car was parked just down the driveway. If she could make it. A sharp whistle cut through the air. A signal. More footsteps emerged from the darkness. Panic surged through her as she realized the truth. This wasn't just one person. She was surrounded. Her chest heaved, desperation clawing at her lungs. She had to think. Had to find a way out. The letters. The journal. The secrets her father had left behind, they were worth something. And whoever these people were, they knew it. A single thought rang in her mind as she backed away, her heart hammering. She was in danger. And she had no idea why. The moment Amoka turned, the cold wind lashed against her soaked skin, sending a violent shiver through her spine. The darkness around her seemed to close in, the heavy rain blurring her vision as she sprinted across the open field behind her father's house. Every step she took felt sluggish against the thick, wet earth. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else except the chilling sound of footsteps chasing after her. A deafening gunshot split the night. She gasped, her body instinctively ducking as a sharp whiz tore through the air near her ear. A bullet. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through her veins. They weren't just following her. They were trying to kill her. Lightning flashed, illuminating the night for a brief second. She saw them, at least 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing, moving fast. They were closing in. Her only chance was to keep running, to find some kind of cover before they caught up. She pushed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her soaked clothes clung to her body, weighing her down. Her father's house was isolated, surrounded by endless farmland and thick forest beyond. If she could just make it into the trees, she might have a chance to hide. But the distance between her and safety felt impossibly vast. Another gunshot rang out. She didn't stop to see where it landed. Her feet pounded against the wet ground as she ran toward the nearest slope. The mud made her slip, sending her crashing onto her hands and knees. She barely registered the pain before scrambling back up, desperation keeping her moving. Her breath hitched as she finally reached the tree line. Darkness swallowed her whole. The rain dripped heavily from the leaves above, creating a chaotic symphony of noise. She ducked behind a thick tree trunk, pressing her back against the rough bark, forcing herself to silence her ragged breathing. She needed to think. Who were these men? Why were they after her? A voice echoed through the trees. Low, commanding. Spread out. She's here somewhere. Amoka squeezed her eyes shut, gripping her arms tightly against her body to stop from trembling. She had to be smart. She had to be quiet. The rain might mask her movements, but if she made one wrong step, she'd give herself away. She inched away from her hiding spot, carefully placing her feet on stable ground to avoid making noise. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent her heart leaping into her throat. She knew they were hunting her. They knew these woods, and she was at a disadvantage. A branch cracked too close to her left. She ducked behind another tree, barely peeking out. A dark figure was only a few yards away, moving slowly, methodically. He had a gun in his hand, its metallic gleam reflecting the faint light from the stormy sky. She couldn't outrun a bullet. She needed to distract them. Her eyes darted to a fallen branch near her foot. Carefully, she picked it up, then threw it in the opposite direction. It landed with a heavy thud against the underbrush. Immediately, the man turned. There, he shouted, rushing toward the noise. It was her only chance. She moved fast, slipping deeper into the forest, careful not to make another mistake. The cold had fully settled into her bones, her muscles screaming for relief. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Then, just as she felt she might escape, a strong hand clamped around her wrist. She let out a sharp scream, twisting wildly, trying to break free. Another hand grabbed her shoulder, shoving her against a tree. The impact sent a sharp pain down her spine. She struggled, thrashing against the grip, but her captor was too strong. "Got you," the man growled. Amoka's eyes darted up, rainwater dripping down her face. The man holding her was tall, his face shadowed, but she could see his expression, cold, determined. She wasn't going down without a fight. She swung her knee upward, connecting hard with his stomach. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to yank free. Without hesitation, she turned and ran again, her lungs burning, her legs barely carrying her forward. She needed to get to the road. If she could flag down a car. A vehicle's headlights suddenly flashed through the trees, its beams cutting through the heavy rain. Hope surged in her chest. She stumbled toward the light, her voice hoarse as she screamed for help. The vehicle, a black SUV, skidded to a stop just ahead. The driver's door opened. Then she saw him. A man stepped out, dressed in dark tactical gear, his face partially obscured by the rain. But even through the storm, she could see his features, sharp, familiar. Her stomach dropped. It was her father's old friend. The one who had spoken at the funeral. The one who had comforted her when she had cried over her father's death. "Amoka," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You need to come with us." "No," she whispered, realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. "These men weren't strangers. They weren't random attackers. They were connected to her father. And they wanted her because of what she had found. The letters. The journal. The secrets he had been too afraid to tell her." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the forest. She had a choice. Run and risk being shot. Or go with them and risk never being seen again. Her heart pounded as the man took a step closer. "Don't make this difficult," he warned. "Your father wanted to protect you. We can help you, but you need to trust us." Amoka took a step back, shaking her head. Her father had feared for his life. He had written about being washed. He had hidden the truth from her for a reason. She didn't trust them. And she wasn't going with them. With one last breath, she turned and sprinted into the darkness. Behind her, she heard the man curse. The SUV's headlights swung wildly as the engine roared to life. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun.